Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We are going to start our class today. I would like to remind you of what we did last time. We talked about the concept of imitation, right, in general, the mimesis of Plato. Then, right, our last class, it was about the response of Aristotle to, right, the concept of mimesis. To whom? To Plato. As I told you that, right, he did not find anything wrong in imitation. On the contrary, he found imitation to be creative, it has natural joy, and also it doesn't have, not all imitations are the same. Right. Today we are going to go to the second part of the poetics, which is about the tragedy in general. The first thing that he starts with, right, okay, which is classification of the elements of the tragedy. Right? And he says that any tragedy, any literary work, of course, I'm referring to, right, a tragedy as the main type dominant at that time, right? At that time, you have to remember that they never had short stories. They never had, right, novels, right? Even the comedies were not actually appreciated at all. Right? But the highest or the most sublime form of poetry at that time, according to Aristotle, it was the tragedy. Right? Okay. And because this man is really genius, he was the first person, right, to analyze the tragedy. And also, I need to remind you again that this analysis, right, is based on what? On the actual teaching of the poetry of his own time. I mean that he did not put the theory, right, out of the blue, out of nothing. But it is based on studying the literature, the existing literature of his own time. And based on this deep study, he managed to analyze what? Analyze, right, it into different, right, elements. And the first element that we talked about last time, it was the plot, right? One point that we defined the plot. Point that I would like to, right, to highlight before I start with the types of the plots, right? That in his definition of the plot, he says that it is an imitation of an action, right? Well, what is the point that I did not focus on last time? Which is the word "an." When he says it is an imitation, the word "an" means one plot, right, of an action. What I mean here, that according to Aristotle's plot, right, that tragedy must have only one major plot, but subplots are not allowed. Right? Unlike William Shakespeare, you know that William Shakespeare, right, is not following the Aristotelian plot, right? Usually, he makes more than one subplot. One major plot, then we have subplots, right? Right? Do you remember anything that you studied for William Shakespeare? Did you study anything for William Shakespeare?
We read, but not studied.
Right. For example, those who are in the literary section, you studied King Lear. Is that correct? Good. In King Lear, for example, that we have two major plots. What are they? The major plot of the king and his own daughters, and Kent and his two sons, right? The one who is legitimate and the other one who is, right, not legitimate, right? And therefore, we find that we have two stories, one major story and one minor story. This minor story, we call it what? A subplot. But according to Aristotle, no subplots are allowed, but only one plot, right? And then he gives us the classification. The plot, he said, right, that any tragedy can be divided into these 6 elements. The plot, or what did we call the plot again? No. A dramatic action, right? The character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. What we are going to do today, right? We are going to start focusing on the first element, which is the plot. Well, Right. He starts by classifying the types of plots, and I gave you an idea about it last time, right? Who remembers that? Right? We said there are three types: the simple plot, right? The complex plot, and the episodic plot. Right? The simple plot, right, which has a beginning and end, but it doesn't have a middle, a development. It doesn't have what we call it the complication, right? All right, and I told you it is the plot in which the hero, right, moves directly from the state of misery into happiness, or vice versa, right? And this is, all right, this type of a plot is not actually encouraged or preferred to, right, appreciated by Aristotle. Do you know why?
Because it doesn't have any plot development.
Yeah.
And the people in that time, they doesn't love it.
Right. Actually, he considers it incomplete.
I don't think
Right.
that it arouses catharsis.
Yeah, because it doesn't have, right, that development, right, or, right, the complication of the problem, right? And I'll tell you what is the complication of the problem today, right? So it has a beginning and end, and therefore it is considered incomplete. While the most preferred, right, okay, is the complex plot. The complex plot. Right? And here what he says that this is the plot. It has a beginning, as I told you, introduction or exposition, right? It has, right, the middle, the development, or, right, the complication, and finally the end, or what he called it, the catastrophe. But, all right, modern expressions, right, we call it what? Resolution. Why we don't say it is a catastrophe? Why? Because, right, if we want to analyze a novel, or we analyze any, a short story, it is not necessarily to end with a disaster, right, or the fall of the good hero. And this is why we use the word resolution nowadays. Right? The last and the worst type of plots, according to Aristotle, is the episodic, right? And the episodic plot is the one that, right, it has what? A beginning, a middle, but it doesn't have an end. It doesn't come to a conclusion. It is incomplete. And why he is considering that a kind of the worst, all right, the worst kind of what? The worst kind of plots, simply because it doesn't achieve catharsis. It doesn't generate the feelings of pity and fear. Because pity and fear, right, are related directly to the ending of the tragedy. And if the tragedy doesn't end, and you have to wait, right, for another episode to come, right, you will feel frustrated, right? زي ما كانوا في رمضان يحطوا لكم باب الحارة تستنوا آخر الشهر تيجي النهاية يقولوا لكم استنوا لرمضان الجاي. Right? Right? And therefore you feel what? That the feelings are not complete. We don't have that sense of pity and fear, and this one is the worst kind of. All right. Well, so what we are going to do now, he is making much, right, focus on the second one, which is, right, fine. And therefore, this is what we are going to explain today, right? What is the complex plot according to Aristotle, right? How it is supposed to be. Well, fine. Okay. So he said that Aristotelian plot the traditional way, right, usually have this shape. Or some other people, they will make it like this, right? Right? In other words, we have a rising action. We have here the top of the complication, what we call it, the climax. And we have a falling action, right? Whether the fall is slow, or what makes the difference between this shape and this shape? This shape, it is, the fall is very fast, fast. We call it a dramatic fall. We call it what? Which means that accelerating fast what? Fall of the hero. Whether this shape or this shape, they are the same, right? Well, fine. So at the beginning here, right, what do we have? We have what we call it, okay, the initiating action. This one, right? The exposition can be named the initiating action. What exactly is presented in the initiating action? Yes. The major problem is introduced. The major problem is introduced. We need to know what is the major problem, right? Also, right, the forces of the conflict are also introduced. We know who is the good one and who is the bad one, and right, okay, or on the other hand, who is against whom? Who is against whom? So the major problem is presented, right? The conflict is introduced, and we have also the major characters are introduced, right? The hero, right? Sorry?
We get to know the heroes and the antagonists, I guess.
Right, yeah, the major characters, right? The protagonist and the antagonist, right? So in this initiating action here, the most important thing, right, is the problem, the major problem, right? And of course, this is in addition to the setting. In addition to the setting. Well, this major problem, if it is going to be solved directly, it will be a simple plot. But, right, what we expect in a complex, right, a complex plot, that the initiating problem or the initial problem is going to become more complicated.
Yeah.
And what do we mean by the word complicated here? That it becomes more than one related problem. More than one related problem. That the problems are consequences of what? Of the major problem, right? Well, right. So this development, we call it the rising, right? Rising action. Right? This rising action in which the problem becomes complicated or becomes more than one related problem. One related problem.
So we have major problem and sub-problem.
Yeah, but they are related to each other. We don't have two different problems. We don't have different plots. One plot, one problem, but right, the problem is escalating. We call it the escalation of the problem. What does it mean of escalation? Means that it becomes more complicated, right? It becomes more difficult, right? Or it becomes more than one related problem. And that not only one problem, but other minor problems consequent to whom? Consequent to the major problem. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. هم صورون. صورت العتمة يا ابو حمزة؟ طيب. نشتغل ولا بدنا نستنى ولا ايش؟ اكمل؟ عادي شغال يعني كل شيء؟ بس يشتغل هذا كيف؟ بيشتغل لحاله؟ تمام. ان شاء الله. So this is the rising action. When the problem comes or reaches the point of complication, right? The highest point of complication, we call it the climax or the peak, right? And of course, we have, right, after the problem is becoming at the highest point, what do we expect? That it will be solved. It will be solved, right? Okay, this right solution comes in a fast movement. What do we call it? The falling action. This falling action in which the sub problems will start to be resolved one after another. One after another. Till we reach what? The resolution of the major problem. Of the major problem. The first problem. The initiating problem. And what do we call it? At that moment, when the major problem is resolved, we call it the resolution or the catastrophe. And in the tragedy, according to Aristotle, this resolution usually must include the fall of the hero. The fall of the hero. So this is how a tragedy, this is what all about. I mean, why do we call it tragedy? Because it will have a sad ending. A sad ending. All right. Well, what are the conditions that are necessary to be found in the Aristotelian plot? Yes.
The three unities, and we mean by this unity of action, one simple thought, unity of time, it should not exceed the single revolution of sun, and unity of place.
Good. This is the first condition, but we have many conditions actually. Right. Right. The first one is that it must have the three unities. The three unities. And what do we mean by the three unities? The unity of time, place. Right. What do we mean by unity of action?
Unity of action, that we must have just one action.
One plot. One, and we already explained this. Right? No subplots are allowed. The unity of time means?
The play must take place, it should not exceed the single revolution of the sun, right? One day, 24 hours.
All right. This is a little bit controversial. How come a story begins and ends in 1 hour, in 1 day, 24 hours? Is it acceptable to you? I mean, the time span of the problem, right? Is it supposed, right, to be only 1 day? If the problems of the world, all right, start in the morning and they end at the evening, life is going to be a utopian life, you know? Right? Do you understand what I mean? But actually, this is not happening. This is unrealistic, right? That the time of the problem, right, might last for years, But what he requires in the unity of time, that, right, the time of acting, the real acting on the stage must cover only one cycle of a sun. A cycle of a sun, which means 24 hours. So again, I'm repeating myself, right? The unity of time here, it means it is not the time of the plot, right? Because the time of the plot might cover, right, long period, right? But the time of acting, the actual acting, right, on the stage, and in order to make it realistic and to be realistic, must cover only 24 hours. Does that mean that they have to spend the 24 hours on the stage? No. Right? But the time covered on, right, that is, or of the problem, or usually the day is the day of the resolution of the problem, right? I mean, the last most important 24 hours, they are the time in which the problem is resolved. But how do we know about the problem, right? Right? Do you understand what I mean? If we are going, right, or the actual acting on the stage only covers the last day or the day of resolution, how do we know about the problem? When did it start? How it developed? Things like that, right? We can understand, right, the history of the problem, the genealogy of what the hero, the protagonist, right, is through two things. The first thing, which is through the song, right, of the chorus, through the song of the chorus. Some might tell me, what do you mean by chorus? And right? We never, I mean, saw chorus in a modern drama. Right, yes.
Because it was necessary in the Greek drama to have a song sung by the chorus, but it's not necessary in the modern drama.
Good. So one of the basic elements of tragedy in the Greek drama is the chorus. And the chorus consists of a group of children, and they usually sing songs, right, for many purposes that we are going to explain when we come to the analysis of the song, right? But these, right, they give us a kind of a background about the origin of the problem, that the history of the problem can be covered through their own song, right? This is the first method. A second method, or a second way in which we know about the history of the problem, it is through the dialogue of whom? Of the characters. Through the dialogue of the characters, we as audience, we get acquainted with what? With the history of the problem and its major development. For example, in Oedipus, the one that we are going to what? We are going to apply on for Sophocles. The problem, right, the time of the problem is almost 50 years, which is, right, the age of the hero. The age of, from the time he is born till the time he is abandoned, till the time he is banished from, right, from his own city, right? Almost 50 years. But the actual acting, right, is only 24 hours, right? How do we know how the problem started and how it developed? What happened to him? Through the song of the chorus and the dialogue. We get acquainted through the dialogue of whom? Of, right, good. Well, this is regarding the unity of time and the unity of place, right? That all actions must.
Must they act it in just one place? What is the stage of the theater or the?
Okay. Right. Unlike William Shakespeare, right? Who moves from one country to another and from one city to another, right? Aristotle thinks that a plot must take, right, only one place. One place, right? Because it is unrealistic to move from one country to another and from one city to another within 24 hours. Do you understand what I mean? Which is the unity of time. And therefore, he says that the all action must take place in one place. And, right, okay, Oedipus, for example, again, I'm going back to Oedipus, all right, to give the same example, because all the action takes place in front of the palace of King Oedipus. The whole play is in front of the palace of King Oedipus, in one place. I think these are limitations which are not followed anymore, right? But anyone who doesn't follow them is not considered as being Aristotelian, right? Right? This is another condition, which is the necessity and the probability, right?
Can we?
Yeah.
Can we please go back to the unity of time now? If we lost the unity of time, is the plot going to be episodic?
No, it is not. It is not. I mean that it is not supposed to cover more than 24 hours. The day of the resolution. The action on the stage is the day of the resolution, in which the problem is solved. But we know everything about the problem, as I told you, from the dialogue and from one. Right. So the action takes place in the last day. In the last day in which the problem is, right, resolved. Right? But if it is not resolved, it means that it is incomplete. It is incomplete. It has a beginning and middle, but it doesn't have, it has an open-ended, right, open-ended plot. But necessarily, all right, episodic, because we don't know whether we're going to have another episode or not, right? Well, necessity and probability, right? Is there anyone who would like to tell me what do we mean that, okay, the plot must follow the rules of necessity and the probability. Necessity here, what is necessary to happen. Probability is what is probable to happen. What is probable? And it is supposed to be both. It is supposed to be, right, in order to make the plot realistic, that it is supposed to be probable to happen. Right? Right? And necessary to happen. Some actions are necessary to happen. Yes, sister.
Yeah, and we should, in the story, we should mix between the necessity and
Probability.
Yeah, probability, to make it near from the real life.
Mm.
To make the images so near from the person life, the audience life.
All right? Good. To make it realistic, as we said.
Yeah.
Right? That the story should, right? For example, right? If we want to talk about, right, King Lear, right? As a familiar example that you already studied. In King Lear, right, the three daughters, right, one of them, Cordelia, the last one, right, is not good in communication. So she couldn't express her love to her father. While the two elder daughters are very cunning, right? And they know how to use the words in order to deceive their own father. Right? And they managed to do that. Right? Is this action probable to happen or not? It is probable to happen. Right? But he himself, King Lear, committed a mistake. He made a crime against his own little daughter. And he must be punished. So it is necessary for the criminal to be punished. If he is not punished, it will not be fair. Right? So any crime, right, must be punished. This is a law of necessity. It is a law of necessity. So we will find that, right, the actions in the tragedy, according to Aristotle, they are supposed to be either, right, probable to happen or necessary to happen. Necessary to happen. Right. So when we find, for example, right, a hero who is having a mistake, commits a mistake. This mistake, we call it a fatal mistake. We call it a fatal mistake. So it is necessary for this hero to fall down at the end. If he doesn't fall down, he's going to be Iron Man. He's going to be Superman. He's going to, which is improbable to happen. Which is improbable to happen. But what is necessary to happen, that he has to fall down at the end because of the fatal mistake that he did. Because of the fatal mistake. Did you get the point, sister? I feel that you didn't get it. You did, right? Good. The third necessary, right? Okay. Part of the plot, according to Aristotle, that it must have two things, right? One thing that he calls peripetia, and one he calls it enignorosis. One is called peripetia, and one is called enignorosis. Right? These words, right? One we call it peripety in English, and the second one we call it a moment of knowledge. So, right? Hold on, yeah. What do we mean by this? Right? Look at this shape here. This is the Aristotelian plot. This is the initiating, right, action. And what is this? Right, what is this? Climax. Both peripetia and enignorosis are here. Right, one is here and one is here. Right? Usually enignorosis comes before, right, the peripetia. What is enignorosis? Enignorosis, it is a moment of enlightenment, a moment of knowledge, right? A moment of discovery in which the hero discovers, right, something for the first time, right? And we usually say, right, the worst moments, right, in a human life, right, when the fool discovers that he's a fool. But this hardly happens. Do you know why? because he's a fool. And this is what happened to King Lear. King Lear discovered at a certain moment that he was a fool. And the fool with him was the wise man. The moment in which he discovered the truth about his own daughters, it was a moment of enignosis. Right? Right? He discovered that he never knew his own daughters well. And the one whom he loves him truly, right? He abandoned her, and he gave all his kingdom to the wrong people. So he discovered that he has done something wrong. So discovering something for the first time, right? We call it a moment of enlightenment. We call it enignosis. It is the moment in which the hero knows something for the first time. And this knowledge, it will lead to a change of his own luck. Yes, please.
Consider that to be something bad or wrong.
Yeah, something. Yeah, it is actually usually bad. Usually, all right. Yes.
So it is the time for remorse and regret, right?
It is the time for fall. It is the time for falling down. It is not the time for remorse, because remorse won't change anything. It would be too late. Right? Knowing something too late. Knowing something too late is a moment of what? Of enignosis. Right? Right. While peripetia is coming after this knowledge. After, right? So this knowledge, it will lead to a change in his own luck. Right? In his own fortune. From being a good fortune into what? A bad fortune. So peripetia, a moment of change from the state of what? Or to the opposite one. To the opposite. So, right, we will say that he's a king, and he thinks that he has been a king for a long time. At a moment, he discovers that he became a king because he killed his own father and he married his own mother. So everything will start going down. Right? The moment of change in which his luck changes from one state to another, what do we call it? We call it peripetia. Yes.
We consider it as a turning point.
At the turning point. It is the turning point. So enignosis comes here while peripetia is here. And both of them part of the climax. Right? Both of them are part of what? Of the climax. Good? Okay? Fine. Right. So what we did today, right, we explained actually, right, the plot. And we are going to stop here, giving you a chance to read about the character, which are going to start, inshallah, after Eid. And therefore, I wish you a happy Eid. Inshallah. Narakum, inshallah.